Hello and welcome. Today, we're going on a pretty wild historical journey. We're going to trace an idea, the idea that a government gets its power from the people it governs. Now, you might think that story starts in 1776 in Philadelphia, but we're going way, way farther back, all the way to the battlefields and ancient abbeys of medieval Scotland. It's a connection that is so much deeper and more dramatic than most of us ever learn.
All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with a really familiar American idea, and then we're going to jump back in time to a Scottish declaration that sounds shockingly modern. After that, we'll dig into the powerful symbols that help create a national identity. We'll relive the incredible battle that made it all possible, and then we'll explore a fascinating and kind of mysterious legend about the Knights Templar that just might have changed everything.
So let's start on familiar ground, the birth of the United States. We're going to grab onto one single powerful thread from America's founding document, and you'll see how pulling it unravels a story that stretches back over 450 years.
This line right here, this is the absolute heart of American democracy. And it feels like it's straight out of the Enlightenment, doesn't it? A revolutionary idea from brilliant minds like Thomas Jefferson. The thought that power doesn't come down from God to a king, but actually flows up from the people. That feels like it was a brand new invention of the 18th century.
And this is the big question that drives our whole explainer today. What if that revolutionary idea wasn't revolutionary at all? It completely challenges the story we all think we know, suggesting that the roots of this idea of freedom are buried way deeper in the much older and frankly much more brutal world of medieval Europe.
So, to find our answer, we have to travel back to the year 1320 to a place called Arbroath Abbey on the coast of Scotland. It's here, after decades of a brutal war for their very survival, that a group of Scottish barons wrote what some historians call one of the greatest pieces of political writing of all time.
Now, on the surface, this letter was a very clever piece of diplomacy. Their king, Robert the Bruce, had been excommunicated by the Pope, which was a huge problem back then. Scotland desperately needed the Pope's approval to be seen as its own independent kingdom, free from England's constant attempts to take over. But hidden inside all the formal Latin was an idea that was just unbelievably radical for its time.
And this is where it gets really interesting. See, the rest of Europe was running on the idea of the divine right of kings. The thinking was, God picks the king, so the king answers only to God. Simple. But the Scots completely flipped that upside down. They argued that a king's right to rule doesn't come from God. It comes up from the people he governs. The community gives him his power. Just listen to the raw power in these words. This isn't just political talk. This is a declaration from the heart. They're saying that freedom is the one thing that matters above all else. It's not about money or fame or power. Freedom is the goal, and they're willing to die for it.
And here it is. This is the absolute mic drop moment of the whole document. They basically say, look, we love our king, Robert the Bruce. He's our hero. But if he ever tries to sell us out to the English, we will kick him out and find a new king who will defend our freedom. Think about that. They're saying the king is an employee of the people, and his job is to protect their liberty. If he fails, he's fired. That is popular sovereignty, clear as day, in the year 1320.
But, a nation isn't just built on big political ideas written on parchment. A nation's identity is woven together from things that are much older, things that speak to the soul, symbols, ancient traditions, and the foundational myths that make a group of people feel like they share a single story.
Okay, let's take the tartan, for example. We all think of it as uniquely Scottish, right? But archaeology tells a much, much bigger story. In Western China, of all places, they found these incredibly well-preserved mummies, thousands of years old, who had European DNA, and they were wearing plaid cloth that looks almost exactly like Scottish tartan. This means Scotland's iconic fabric is part of a tradition that's ancient and spread all across Europe.
But if you think the tartan has a deep history, wait till you hear about the Stone of Destiny. It might just look like a boring block of sandstone, but this thing is soaked in legend. It was believed to be the sacred stone that all the first kings of Scotland were crowned upon, and its story was designed to connect the Scottish nation to something ancient, holy, and chosen by God.
So, the legend goes, this is no ordinary rock. This is Jacob's pillow, from the Bible, the stone he used when he dreamed of a ladder to heaven. The story claims the prophet Jeremiah saved it from Jerusalem when the Babylonians attacked and brought it to Ireland.
From there, it eventually came to Scotland, giving the Scottish kings a direct divine link all the way back to the ancient Israelites. Now, this stone was so important that when King Edward I of England conquered Scotland, he took it as the ultimate trophy. For 700 years, it sat in Westminster Abbey, right under the English coronation throne, a constant symbol of English power over Scotland. So you can imagine what a huge deal it was when it was finally officially returned to Scotland in 1996. It was more than just getting a rock back, it was a recognition of Scotland's unique identity.
But let's be real. Political declarations and ancient symbols don't mean a thing if you can't back them up with force. The powerful ideas in the Declaration of Arbroath would have just been empty words if it wasn't for an absolutely stunning, almost impossible military victory that happened 6 years earlier.
So, in the summer of 1314, the English king, Edward II, marched north with the biggest army England had ever sent into Scotland. We're talking about 27,000 soldiers, including thousands of elite, armored knights. And who did they face? Robert the Bruce and an army of about 6,000 Scots, most of them just regular guys with long spears. The odds were, well, they were just completely insane.
The battle kicked off with something straight out of a movie. An English knight saw Robert the Bruce and charged him, lance down, ready for the kill. But Bruce, on his smaller horse and with only a battle axe, dodged the lance at the last second and brought his axe down so hard he split the knight's skull right through his helmet. That one act of courage sent a jolt of electricity through the entire Scottish army. Then, that night, a Scottish noble snuck out of the English camp and told Bruce their morale was terrible. So Bruce made a gutsy call. Instead of defending, they would attack.
What happened next was one of the greatest upsets in military history. But the official version of how the battle ended might not be the whole story. There's another, more mysterious legend about what really happened, a story that involves the most famous and feared warriors of the entire medieval world.
The fighting on the second day was brutal. At a key moment, the Scottish lines were starting to bend. Bruce had one last card to play, his tiny reserve force. It was maybe 50 guys on horseback. He sent them charging out from the woods. And then the unthinkable happened. The massive English army, thousands and thousands of professional soldiers, saw this small charge and they just broke. They turned and ran in a total absolute panic.
So you have to ask yourself, what on earth could make a battle-hardened army do that? Why would they flee from such a tiny force? Well, the legend says the answer isn't about how many knights were charging, but about who they were and what flag they were carrying.
The theory is that these weren't just any knights. They were the last of the Knights Templar. See, just a few years earlier, the Templar Order was destroyed all across Europe, but their huge fleet of ships was never found. One rumor is that they sailed to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce, who was also an enemy of the Pope, would have welcomed them. So if those charging knights suddenly unfurled the famous black and white banner of the Templars, it might have been enough to cause pure superstitious terror in the English army and completely change the course of history.
So when you step back and look at this whole story, you see this amazing dance between two things. On one hand, you have the hard facts of history, a political letter, a military victory. But on the other hand, you have the power of myth, a sacred stone from the Bible, a secret army of warrior monks. You really can't build a nation without both. History gives you the events, but myth is what gives those events their lasting meaning.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, first, that the American idea of government by the consent of the governed wasn't born in 1776. It is a direct ancestor in a Scottish letter from the 1300s. Second, a nation's identity is always a powerful mix of real history, political ideas, and the legends people tell about themselves. And finally, to really understand the past, you have to look at not just what was written down, but also at what was believed.
And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. In any nation's story, there's a line between what we can prove happened and the myths that people choose to believe about who they are. That line is always a little blurry. And maybe the most important question isn't just what happened, but what stories do we choose to remember and why? Because in the end, those stories, both the real and the legendary, are what make us who we are today.